Good evening. Welcome to uh, Buddhism in a Nutshell. Buddhism in a Nutshell is one of FPMT's kind of established courses. Uh, our center, Tupten Norbu Ling, is an affiliate of FPMT. FPMT is an acronym that stands for the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition. They have centers and services all across the world. We're physically based in Santa Fe in New Mexico. Our center is physically here, but everything we do, for the most part, almost everything we do is also available via Zoom as it's happening, whether it's happening at the center or in someone's home, as is the case this evening. Um, but it's a course that FPMT designed to provide a very broad level overview of Buddhist philosophy. Next month, we will do Meditation 101. These are two sort of companion courses. They can be taken individually, but Buddhism in a Nutshell is intended to focus on the philosophical side of things, and Meditation 101 is intended to focus not really not as much with respect to the group practice of meditation, but more so what a person would need to know, or what would be helpful for a person to know to be able to start a practice on their own. There's some group practice of meditation, but we do offer express meditation Monday through Friday at 7:30 a.m. Mountain Time. That's a 30-minute guided meditation that we do 5 days a week. So that's what we really have for more so the group practice. But so of course you can just take this class. You don't have to take Meditation 101, but they're sort of designed to be a comprehensive overview, both the philosophical side and the meditation side. And then in September, there's a third introductory level class that's actually moving to Tuesdays. It won't be on Fridays, it'll be on Tuesdays. That's called Introduction to Mindfulness. And so that's kind of a deeper dive on the concept of mindfulness and mindfulness as it relates to meditation. So those are the three classes that are kind of FPMT's introductory courses, those three. But we are moving from Fridays to Tuesdays permanently beginning in September. Are there any questions about the center? Or I know I've only said a few things, but did anybody come in with a question that they were wanting to ask off the bat? Nope. Okay. So, as I said, we are an affiliate of FPMT. Our center is called Tupten Norbu Ling, and we're in Santa Fe. We are presenting Buddhism from the perspective of the Tibetan tradition. So just like any religion, Christianity, what have you, Judaism, Islam, there are different ways that it's packaged. There are different traditions, just like you've got Protestantism and Catholicism and, the Baptists and so on. You've got different traditions. Within Buddhism, you've also got different traditions. And but everything that we are going to be presenting is going to be coming from the Tibetan tradition. And particularly, even within the Tibetan tradition, you've got four schools, four main schools of thought. And we are coming from what's called the Gelug tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. You've got Gelug and Sakya and Nyingma and Kagyu. But we are FPMT, and our center, Tupten Norbu Ling, we are based in the Gelug tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. So that's where everything, no matter what it is, no matter what kind of course that we offer, it will be steeped in that particular way of packaging the teachings. And Tibetan Buddhism is part of a broad, which we'll look at a little bit toward the end of today's class, a broad category called the Mahayana school of Buddhism. There's two very, very broad categories globally, Mahayana and Theravada. And so Tibetan Buddhism is always classified in the Mahayana tradition rather than the Theravada tradition. And we'll look at that a little bit as we go along. So today's class is sort of designed to set the stage for the course. We will be looking because um, Buddhism comes from the teachings of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. So we will be looking tonight sort of at his life story and the origins of those teachings, and going a little bit introducing the philosophical side of things. But we have to sort of set the stage and talking about where those teachings come from before we go into that. Okay. So any questions before we
How do you spell that? Gula? The school?
the Gelug, Gelug.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So as I said, we'll be beginning by looking at the life of the Buddha. And the Buddha was not born as the Buddha. Buddha is a title. It means the one who is awake, or the awakened one. So it was a title that was bestowed or given to him by his students, by those that he taught. The organization of monks and nuns and lay people that he led later in life, he became known by those followers as the one who is awake. But he was born as Siddhartha Gautama. And he was born, the phrase that they use is prince, because Prince Siddhartha. And what we're talking about here when we say prince, it's not anywhere near as grand as you might think of in terms of the English kings and queens, or even French, or what have you, the sort of European traditions that we are familiar with. We're talking about the region that is both India and Nepal, present day India and Nepal, that region. And we're talking about 2,600 years ago. And so what was happening in that general region 2,600 years ago is that there were a number of, quite modest city-states. And it is true that they did have rulers of the city-states. And, I don't know what the Nepali word or king or prince, but that's what they've decided, because it was a very similar kind of idea. It was a familial lineage. It was a patriarchal system. So generally the male would be what in English we would call the king, and then his son, his firstborn, eldest, son would succeed him and also be the ruler of this city-state. But it's quite modest compared to anything that we are familiar with. Of course, I suppose if you go back to medieval times, maybe something a bit more similar to that than what we would think of in terms of the monarchies of, these sprawling monarchies. These were small city-states. But still, it is historically accurate to say that Siddhartha was born into a family where his father was the ruler of a city-state, and it was his legacy to become also the ruler of this city-state. And so, as is common, or relatively common at the time when Siddhartha was born, his father took him to, you could say, a spiritual seer, someone who was known or thought to have some clairvoyance, to kind of get a reading for his life, to kind of get a prediction of how things were going to go. And this seer told his father that he was able to see that Siddhartha had two kind of tracks in his life, two paths that were open to him. One path would be to follow in the footsteps of his father. And if he did do that, then it was prophesied by this person that he would be successful in uniting all of these city-states, all of these small sort of fiefdoms into a grand empire that would be based on political power, conquest, war, domination, that sort of thing. Because he was from the warrior caste in that society. That was his particular caste or station, was this warrior class. So that was one possibility for his life. The other possibility is that Siddhartha might reject what his father was wanting him to do, and he would instead go into a more spiritual direction. And if he did that, then this seer predicted that Siddhartha would have the same level of success in uniting all of these small kingdoms, but that he would do it not through domination, not through political power or, force, but by creating a shared philosophical religious system that people would buy into and subscribe to and participate in, and that would join all of these different tribes, these different groups into a spiritual family rather than a political dynasty. And his father really did want him to follow in his footsteps. And so it is explained in the sutras that his father took great pains to isolate Siddhartha from society, to just kind of raise him in a very isolated way. And so Siddhartha never really left the sort of familial compound that his family owned, and again, probably quite modest, but more than one building, in sort of at least a small area. And this compound, he lived his whole life there, being very shielded from interacting with society in general. Uh, but there came a point where he just got curious. In his, early his early 20s, he just got very curious about what was out there, what was in the local town. So he kind of snuck out. And when he snuck out and traveled to the local town, he came across what are called the four sites. And so these are four different people that he came across. One is a dead person, but a dead body. So he came across first an extremely old person. So again, like I said, up till this point, his life had been very isolated, and he had never really experienced the sufferings of, hadn't witnessed people experiencing the sufferings of extreme old age, the kind of ravages that can happen to a body when a person is in their 80s and their 90s, when they're quite frail, and they're just sort of, maybe they have a cane and they've lost a lot of muscle mass and so on. He didn't know that that was something that people experienced. And then he came across a really, really sick person. So could have been, someone who had boils on their skin, maybe, a leper, or someone who had, some sort of ravaging sort of disease that was quite apparent just by observing them. And he again hadn't experienced that kind of suffering, didn't know that it wasn't particularly uncommon for people to potentially experience that sort of suffering either. And then he came across, as I mentioned, a dead body. It was very common, still is very common in that culture, in that region, for these open air funeral processions, just sort of a body on a cart, going through the streets. So he witnessed this dead body. Um, and these three kinds of suffering he was experiencing or being made aware of for the first time in his life. The suffering of old age, the suffering of sickness, extreme sickness, not just like having a cold but, really truly being deeply affected by illness, and then death. And he traveled to this town with his charioteer. Um, and he was quizzing this person who worked in that compound, worked for his family, traveled with him, was quizzing him, you know, how unusual were these things? How out of character, were these experiences? And this was a townsperson who, just like us, was experiencing these things at a very young age. We all can relate to this sort of experience, the first time that we kind of saw our grandparents, or we passed people on the street who were, really, really struggling just from being quite elderly. And we've also seen, people who were really ravaged with illness. And we've also, at probably a relatively young age, attended a funeral. We've lost family pets. We've had all of these same experiences, but we weren't 20 years old. We had them when we were 2 and 5 and 7, and our parents didn't intentionally prevent us from trying to learn about that. And so we were kind of guided into that. But when you're 20 and learning about all of that for the very first time, it's quite shocking. So he and this charioteer, who did have that normal upbringing, said, well, no, of course, everyone experiences, if you happen to live long enough, you experience the suffering of old age. If you happen to live long enough, you experience the suffering of sickness. And then, of course, every life ends in death. Every human has to experience the suffering of going through the death process. Um, and this affected Siddhartha greatly, knowing that he himself was subject to sickness, aging, and death, and everyone that he loved was subject to sickness, aging, and death. Then he came across, here it says mendicant, a spiritual seeker. There were many existent religious spiritual traditions in this region at the time, and he came across one of these people, one of these spiritual seekers, these spiritual mendicants, and he could see that this person had some sort of some quality about them. He could see that this person had, some sort of peace of mind, something about the way that they carried themselves, something about the way that they looked. He could get a sense that they had some realization, that they knew something that he didn't know, that they had a way of being in the world that was apparent. And I think we've all had that experience too. We've all been around, maybe, meditators, or we've seen His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, on television. We can kind of see, he's not quite ordinary. We've all been around people who had that sort of energy, that spiritual energy to them that you can pick up on. And he was picking up on that. And so he thought, okay, well, I am subject to sickness, aging, and death, and I don't want to be. Everyone that I love is subject to sickness, aging, and death, and I don't want them to be. So maybe this person, this spiritual seeker, maybe they have a solution. Maybe they have found an answer to how to avoid, how to escape sufferings of sickness, aging, and death. Maybe if I pursue that, then I too can figure out how to avoid these sufferings, not only for myself, but then I can teach everyone that I love. I can teach all of my friends, my family, and everyone can then escape sickness, aging, and death. So that's what he did. he left home. He renounced his land. He renounced his titles. He did what's called going forth into homelessness, and became a spiritual seeker, spiritual mendicant, using the religious spiritual systems that existed at the time, following those systems. Um, so, yeah, so that's kind of his trajectory into seeking spirituality. So he was born, Siddhartha was born in a town in what is present day Lumbini. It's called, just the name of the town, it's called Lumbini. It's on the border between India and Nepal. Again, these are present day countries, present day borders, but the birthplace of Siddhartha was Lumbini in present day Nepal. And so I just have, some slides, some background on that. This is the Maya Devi temple in Lumbini. It's it's understood or thought that people know based on records and things, that historical records, that they know where his mother gave birth. The story is that she kind of gave birth in a park, kind of, she was just pregnant and sort of walking through a park of trees, and just gave birth right there on the on the stones, the the paved kind of walkway that she was on. Um, and so the Maya Devi, her name was Maya. And so the Maya Devi temple was erected at the site of his actual birth. So it didn't happen like in a home, or, literally she just kind of stopped her walk and gave birth and kept going, So, as I guess 2,600 years ago, it's not that uncommon. And so then these are some pictures of inside the Maya Devi temple. Um, And then this is a picture of a case where this is considered to be, or is presented as, the paving stone where his mother gave birth. They've put it in a sort of acrylic case inside the Maya Devi temple, and they're kind of saying, well, this is the paving stone. I don't know if they're how sure they are about that, but this is the paving stone that is considered to be the one that she gave birth on. Any thoughts or questions before I continue? Okay. So this is, so then kind of going back to the, you may have to go full screen to kind of see that better. It depends on also what device you're using, but it's just a map that shows a journey that you could take. It's not necessarily the exact journey that Siddhartha took, but the journey from his birthplace to Bodh Gaya, this town where he became enlightened. The place of his enlightenment was Bodh Gaya. So to go back to, as I said, once he went forth into homelessness, then he traveled around with these other spiritual seekers and followed the religious traditions of the time. Um, and there, at the time, the prevailing spiritual view, or process or technique, was based very much in asceticism. So that was the predominant spiritual approach at that time and that place. The theory was that a person by punishing the body, a person's mind could transcend the limitations of the flesh. That was kind of the underlying philosophical idea. And Siddhartha picked that up and kind of ran with that because that's what the people around him were doing. So they would be known for not sleeping, for days on end. They would be known for standing in cold, rushing waters, not eating, not drinking for, days at a time. Again, really trying to punish the body in order so that the mind could escape, could transcend the flesh. And Siddhartha, who is not yet the Buddha, did all of these practices, and he found that they didn't really work that well. He found that that he became weak, that his meditation was cloudy, not focused, not sharp, because of all of the punishment that his body was undertaking. And you can find in mostly Theravadan temples, not so much in it's not a form that you find in the Tibetan tradition, but you find what's sort of an emaciated form of Siddhartha. They call it the starving Buddha, but he wasn't yet known as the Buddha. But it represents this period of time of his spiritual training, where he was undergoing all of these extreme ascetic practices. And he became, as the statues that you can find in the temples, as they depict, he became extremely emaciated, and he was quite near death at one point trying to follow these ascetic practices. And the story goes that he was trying to meditate by the bank of a river, not having eaten or slept in, who knows how long. And there was a raft there was a raft floating down the river with some sort of musician, or just someone who had an instrument, who enjoyed playing an instrument, traveling down this raft. And the instrument was a stringed instrument of some sort. And the person was, plucking the strings, perhaps doing something with the strings. I don't know if it was a bow or just plucking, but, playing the strings in some way. And for Siddhartha, the music that this person was producing was incredibly beautiful. Siddhartha had this sort of transcendent experience of this music, and he had a realization that the musician was able to create that music because the strings of the musician's instrument were tuned in the right way. If the strings had been quite loose, then nothing would have happened. No sound would have been produced. If the strings were quite tight, if they were overly tightened, then the sound would have been quite harsh, like a violin string. If you overly tighten it and then you bow it, it makes a very grating, harsh, unpleasant sound. Uh, but this music was really beautiful to Siddhartha. And Siddhartha realized that was because the instrument was tuned in between these two extremes. And for him, um, his epiphany at that moment was that he had gone too far into the extreme of asceticism, that his instrument of the body was too tightly wound, and he wasn't successful in his meditation because of that. If he had gone too much in the opposite direction, then that would be more like just total laziness, hedonism, kind of just pure sensory indulgence, not making time, not putting effort into his practice at all. That could have been the other extreme. And, he wasn't doing that, but he went too far into these sort of punishing practices. So at this time, he began to eat, he began to drink, nourish the body, Um, and the people that he was with felt like he had abandoned the training, felt like he had abandoned spirituality, and they sort of rejected him. And so he went off on his own. And that's what this slide is depicting, is that eventually he ends up in a town called Bodh Gaya. That's what it's called now. I don't know what it was called 2,600 years ago, but it's present day Bodh Gaya. And Bodh Gaya is known as the place of Siddhartha's enlightenment. Um, and this slide is a picture of what's called the Bodhi tree. It's in Bodh Gaya now, and because the story goes that when Siddhartha sat for his final meditation, and he did so under a tree, for the shade and the protection and so on, and he made a determination, a resolve that he wouldn't arise from meditation until he had achieved enlightenment. And that was the seat where he achieved his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Now, this tree, being 2,600 years later, is something like a sapling of a sapling of a sapling of a sapling of the original Bodhi tree. It isn't, no one saying that tree has been there for 2,600 years, because I don't think that's the kind of, there are very few trees that can do that. I don't believe it's one of those trees that's even possible, but it's a cutting or a sapling. They protected it over the millennia, and it's understood to be an actual descendant through cuttings or through saplings of that tree. And it is still in Bodh Gaya. You can go and meditate under, or at least near, the Bodhi tree, what's called the Bodhi tree. Called the Bodhi tree because Bodhi means awakening. And so the place of awakening, the tree of awakening. It's the same root word as Bud, which is in Buddha, the one who is awake. Bodhi, Buddha, it's the same root, Sanskrit, or, word, or Pali, or, whatever root language. So the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. And then I have some photographs of Bodh Gaya, present day Bodh Gaya, with all of the beautiful monuments that have been erected, and things now in present day Bodh Gaya. So then this is another map, and it shows, again, a possible journey, not necessarily the exact journey, but a journey between Bodh Gaya and a town called present day Sarnath. It's called Sarnath, or it's called Deer Park. And it's the site of the Buddha's first teaching. So the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, and then traveled. And you can see a river here, so I assume there's a bridge somewhere along that river. So he traveled quite far, and his first teaching was at this place called Sarnath, or Deer Park, because there were a lot of deer there at the time. And these are just, again, some photographs of Sarnath, Deer Park. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? So now we'll start to get into, again, some of that philosophical side of things, what we're going to be spending this month-long course on, talking about a very, very broad level overview of what the Buddha taught. So everything that we call Buddhism are the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, who became known as the Buddha. He lived for about another, well, almost 50 years or so after his enlightenment, and traveled around and gave teachings. You've probably heard the word sutra. The words, that's where his teachings were eventually written down. They were written down in what are called the sutras. Um, and so that's everything that we call Buddhism are just those teachings. They all come from the the oral teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, during that one lifetime. Of course, you've got 2,600 years of history since then, and it's certainly true, and we'll talk a bit about that as we go along, that after the Buddha, there came, there were um, monasteries that were created, there were places of learning that were established. And over time, there came to be extraordinary scholars and meditators and scholars, these, luminaries of Buddhism that came after the Buddha. And they certainly have given us commentaries. They have given us treatises and commentaries, ways of thinking about the sutras, ways of making sense of the sutras, but they are not adding anything new to Buddhism. They are just explaining the sutras. They're giving us commentaries or ways of understanding the original sutra material of the Buddha. And so everything is traceable, and it's considered incredibly important, really not to add anything, that everything that we need is there in the sutras. And you can maybe update the examples and give, but that the Buddha explained everything that needed to be explained, and that everything is there in the teachings from the historical Buddha. But there are ways, there are commentaries that help us to make sense of the sutras, to make it easier to study the sutras than going through all of the sutras, ourselves. There are condensed ways of presenting the material of the Buddha. But his first teaching at Deer Park, at Sarnath, is called the Four, and we, in English, became known as now we would call it the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. And everything that he was going to go on to teach falls under one or more of the Four Noble Truths. Everything in the sutras is an explanation or further elaboration of one or more of the Four Noble Truths. And things do get a bit complicated, even just from the title, the phrasing, the Four Noble Truths, because what we see here and what we're going to see as we go through the course is that we speak English, and so we rely on people who have translated, the original Pali from the Sanskrit, into English, and they have had to pick words that are close to or sort of in some way convey some aspect of the original meaning, but a lot of the words that are original are very, very technical words. And they don't really mean what we use the English words to mean. They're just kind of the best that we can do because we don't speak Pali, we don't speak Sanskrit. And so we're stuck with kind of words that are getting at technical concepts that are not really similar in a lot of ways to what the ordinary English usage of the word is. And noble, unfortunately, falls into that category. Because for us, when we hear the word noble, we think, oh yeah, these are four ideas that are dignified in some way. They're getting at something that has some nobility to it, that's dignified, that has some kind of authenticity. And that's not what the word noble means at all in this context. Noble is an English word that's being used to translate the word Arya. And an Arya, Arya, is a type of person who has achieved a particular level of spiritual development. So a person becomes an Arya being through their own training. You start off just like all of us as ordinary people, and then as you train the mind uh, through meditation, through discipline, and so on, you could at some point achieve, and we'll go into what it means to do all of these things over the course, but at a certain point, a person has what's called a direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. And I'm going to leave it with that phrasing for now because it doesn't mean anything. And so I don't want to use phrasing that might give you a preconceived notion of what that is. But when we get there, we'll explain it, more so like in the last class, we will explain what that insight is in a general sense. Um, but when a person does that, when they have a direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality, they become an Arya being. And they see things in a very different way than we see them. When they look at the world, because they've trained their mind to see the nature of reality directly, they are observing the world and experiencing the world in a very different way than a person who doesn't have the ability to see the nature of reality directly is seeing or experiencing the world. So the Four Noble Truths are the four things that are known to be true by Arya beings. When an Arya being looks at the world, they understand these four things are true about the world. Um, the world can be understood as being categorized in these four ways validly. Uh, and we don't see the world. And from the Buddhist perspective, the problem is, as ordinary beings, we don't see the world this way. We don't understand that we can, as I said, all Arya beings were once ordinary beings. They started out just like we did, and they practiced and trained their mind, and they achieved this particular result of becoming an Arya being and being able to see the world in this way. Um, and that's what we ultimately and we also that we actually want to go further than that, because an Arya being is not a Buddha. An Arya being is not a fully enlightened being. But compared to us, they're quite different. Compared to us as an ordinary being who doesn't have this realization at all, they see the world in a much clearer, much more accurate, much more realistic way than we are seeing it. So that's what the Buddha taught. He taught these are the four things that those who have trained their mind in this way, this is what they understand about the world. And I'm sure we probably in school, you heard the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. These four truths, these four things that are known to the Aryas. Okay, so we'll start with the first of the Four Noble Truths, and here I I just said it in a way that is kind of the common way of saying it. The truth of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. But another way of phrasing it that I think makes it more clear is to just say true suffering, true origin, true cessation, true paths. Because as ordinary beings, we kind of have our own version of these four things. We also are looking at the world, and we as ordinary beings, we have some understanding of these four things, but we're going to kind of look at why our understanding isn't the same as the Arya's understanding and why that difference is a problem from the Buddhist perspective, why you want to progress to this deeper, more accurate understanding. So, true suffering is the first noble truth. And true suffering, and so you've probably also heard another phrasing of the Four Noble Truths, which is, life is suffering. The first noble truth. That's a common way of, or everything is suffering, or life is suffering, and that is the. Some people have said, I've heard some people say that that sentence is like the most damaging sentence in all of Buddhism in terms of like people getting interested in it, thinking it's not this kind of incredibly depressing, pessimistic idea, because it isn't like that. That's not the intent. It isn't, we're not meant to think that everything is awful, everything is, just miserable and painful. Um, Ultimately, what we're trying to see is that when we live our lives on a purely materialistic level, on a kind of surface level, that kind of existence is one that is marked by persistent unsatisfactoriness. It's persistently or um, kind of universally, but by its nature, not fulfilling, not truly satisfying. Um, it's kind of like the word dukkha, maybe you've heard, is where this word suffering comes from. Dukkha, dukkha. And from what I understand, the word dukkha itself kind of has a connotation of like sort of like a wonky wheel, kind of like a shopping cart that has a wonky kind of like a stuck wheel where, when you live your life from that materialistic perspective, you're trying to push this cart, this in one direction, but because it has a wonky wheel, it doesn't actually go where you want. Like it doesn't, it gets stuck, it, hits walls, you have to kind of pick it up and then, push it, and you get frustrated and you get annoyed, and, all of these things are happening because your life just kind of has this characteristic of this sort of wheel that, kind of works but doesn't fully work. It never really does exactly what you want. And is that's true about all ordinary existences that are lived on this kind of surface materialistic level. And we can say that there's three types of true suffering. There's so we'll start with the first. The first is called the suffering of pain. Um, and the suffering of pain is not controversial. It's not difficult to understand. It is any kind of overt physical or mental distress or unwished for condition. So if you were to ask anyone on the street, to list suffering, to list, a headache, losing your job, etc., those are all the suffering of pain. Um, so, could be, not getting what you want, um, aging, losing your job, not being able, thinking about the food that you've got in the fridge, that you're looking forward to, and you get home and you found that somebody else in your household, ate your leftovers that you were so excited about, and that kind of, that frustration that arises in the mind. That's all the suffering of pain. Any kind of overt physical or mental distress or unpleasant experience. And the only thing here with this one is, that bears additional contemplation, because we're all in agreement of what it is and that we do experience it. But the, the 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 Buddhist view might suggest that we tend to minimize how prevalent the suffering of pain is, how many times in a day we kind of normalize it. We kind of think, oh, well, that's just, the fact that my back kind of aches, more often than not. Well, that's just kind of normal. The fact that, you know, every time I go out into the sun in the summertime, it's kind of unpleasant, and then I go into the shade and I feel better, and and then I get hungry every day, I get thirsty every day. The we have these unpleasant experiences kind of all of the time. And we just normalize it because we don't recognize that it is removable. We don't recognize that it's something that we can do anything about. And so we sort of minimize it. So that's something that bears thinking about is, is it true that we gloss over, or that we minimize, or that we don't fully um, take into account how prevalent the suffering of pain really is? But it's not controversial in terms of how you define it, how you understand it. But the second category of true suffering is, in a way, much more important. It's called here the suffering of change, or changeable suffering. And the problem with changeable suffering is that, just like if you were to ask, a person off of the street to list suffering, everything that you would get from that person when they say, "Oh, when my dog died," or when the movie that I wanted was sold out, or a traffic jam, you know, they would everything that they would list, if you were to say what is suffering, the Buddha would agree that's all the suffering of pain. That's all validly the suffering of pain. But if you were to ask that same person, what is happiness? For the Buddha, everything that that person would list, whether it is eating your favorite food, or listening to your favorite music, or going to an amusement park, or spending time, with your loved one, your wife, your children, your best friend, um, feeling, going for a nice, walk in nature, and the sort of pleasant feelings that arise. The Buddha would say everything that an ordinary person understands as happiness falls under the category of the suffering of change, changeable suffering. And so that's a real problem. Again, this falls into the disconnect between how an ordinary being like us, and an Arya being is observing the world, is experiencing the world, is understanding the world that we are living in. Because we think that all of those things are the point of our life. We think that the point of our life is to get enough wealth, to be comfortable, to surround ourselves with sensory pleasures, to, you know, spend time with people that we enjoy spending time with, to be able to, engage in whatever it is that for us, whether it's going to plays or going to concerts, or, engaging in recreational entertainment activities. We think that's the point of our life, is to have as many of those experiences as possible, and try to have as few unpleasant experiences as possible. So to reduce the suffering of pain, and to maximize, for the Buddha, the suffering of change. But the Buddha says, no, it isn't happiness. It's the suffering of change. And it is so for two reasons. One is less important than the other. The first reason, the less important one, is because it can't last. It's fleeting in its nature. The food, the conversations, the whatever it is, the play, the music, the movie, whatever it is that we enjoy, that we're like, oh, this is really pleasant. I'm having a good time. That experience is going to end, and it's not going to end. It's going to end relatively quickly. It's a fleeting experience. It's a pleasant taste. It's a pleasant sound. It's a pleasant touch, and it has a very, very short duration. So, in that way, it can't really be happiness because it's so transient in its nature. At a minimum, it's not a deep, abiding, lasting sense of happiness because we're looking for something outside of ourselves. We're looking for this kind of sensory experience, that kind of sensor, whether it's a mental sense or physical sense. We're looking for something to please, to soothe our senses. And so it's necessarily dependent upon being able to be in contact with something outside of ourselves. So that thing is not going to be there forever, and it's unreliable. And so in that sense, it's not true, genuine, lasting, real happiness. But then on a deeper level, what the Buddha is also going to explain about this process is that when we engage in a pleasure-seeking behavior, going to the theater, putting on the music, calling up our friend to have a conversation, um, turning on the television to watch the new movie that's come out that we are excited about watching, we are engaging, we're motivated to engage in all of those pleasure-seeking behaviors because there's something agitating about the present moment. We are bored, we are hungry, we are maybe, depressed, we are lonely, we're experiencing the suffering of pain in some way. We're experiencing, again, any one of those: loneliness, anxiety, depression, boredom. There's something in the mind at that moment that is uncomfortable. And we're noticing that, and we're like, oh, I need to do something about this. I need to find something to watch, or something pleasant to eat, or someone to spend time talking to, or something to do. Um, and so, best case scenario, we do that. We go to the movie, we go to the play, we do whatever it is. And what the Buddha is suggesting is that that is a new stimulus that we are introducing. And what it is doing is it's providing a sense of relief in the first moment from that previously felt uncomfortable experience, the depression, the anxiety, the loneliness, the boredom, that reached a crescendo in the mind. And then when that happened, we were like, okay, I've got to do something. I have to bring something new into my experience. If we're successful, then we feel, oh, I'm not bored anymore. I'm not lonely. I'm not anxious because there's a movie now. There's a music playing. There is something new in my environment that is providing a sense of relief. But that new stimulus, and it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it is a movie, or if it is talking to our best friend, or if it's eating delicious food. That new stimulus, by its nature, it comes along with its own unique suffering. So if we think about the food that we most enjoy in the world, whatever it is, if that food was the only food that was ever available to us for the rest of our lives, it wouldn't take but a few days, a few weeks, maybe a couple of months before we never wanted to see that, smell that, taste that. We would be desperate for something else, for some other experience. Maybe it could take a year, who knows? But at some point, we would get to a point where if it was breakfast, lunch, dinner, every snack, all day, every day, one food, even if it's our favorite food, we would we would learn to not be able to even we'd get not nauseated by the smell of it at some point. If it's the person that we most love in the world, and we were locked in a room with that person, and we could do nothing but speak to them, at some point we would really like to be separated from that person. I'm not, we'd still love them, they'd still be, but we would really be motivated to like leave the room, have a different experience, talk to somebody else, do something else. Um, if it's our favorite movie or our favorite album, and we watch it, and then we get strapped to the chair and the movie starts over again. And it's the same movie, right? It's the same thing. We said in our own mind, we said, this is happiness. If I could only go do this, if I could only watch this movie or this television show or eat this food or talk to this person, then I'll be happy. Then I will experience happiness. But we can see that it doesn't matter what that experience is. If we were limited to only that experience, it would become painful for oneself at some point through repetition, through not being able to do anything other than that. We ourselves would become agitated. We ourselves would become, and like with food, we know that we have to stop at a certain point. Like, even if it is delicious, like if they brought out another plate and they said, you must finish this plate, we'd throw up at a certain point, right? Because it isn't in the nature of happiness. None of those experiences are in the nature of happiness. What they can do is temporarily, momentarily provide a sense of distraction, a sense of relief from that agitation that was there in the mind before, but they come along with their own unique suffering, which grows over time. You would enjoy talking to your husband, your wife, your best friend for an hour, 2 hours, but not a month, not 6 months. And from that first moment to a month from then, that your unhappiness, your dissatisfaction would grow. It would get greater and greater. And then you would really, just like that previous moment of the boredom, the loneliness, the anxiety, you would experience this overwhelming urge to do something about this new suffering. And you'd be like, okay, thank you very much. I have to leave. I really enjoyed our conversation, but this is too long and I've got to go do something else, or I have to eat a different kind of food. I have to have a different kind of experience. And that's because anything that is a worldly, ordinary pleasure is going to necessarily come along with its own unique suffering. And we will begin to experience that suffering if we simply remain in contact with that object for long enough. Um, and so we can clearly see that we are mistaken when we think that that is happiness, because if it was happiness, not only would it not be fleeting in its nature, but the longer that we engaged with it, the more that we were in contact with it, the happier and happier and happier we ourselves internally would become. Because it is in the nature of happiness and it can't do anything other than make us happier and happier, just like heat is in the nature of being hot. And so when you are in the presence of heat, you don't become colder at some point. You can only become hotter over time because it truly is in the nature of heat. And cold is in the nature of cold. If you are in the presence of cold, you have no option but to become colder and colder. So, if we are correct that these pleasant experiences are genuinely in the nature of happiness, then the more that we engage in them, necessarily the happier and happier we would become. Um, but we've never had that experience. We've never, just in our own actual lives, we've never actually had that experience. The experience that we're all having is that we're jumping from one thing to another, at the point where any of the individual things that we're doing become unpleasant. We're like, okay, I did this, that was fine, but now I need to do something else. Okay, I did this, that was fine, but I need to do something else. Because each of the things that we're doing, they cause the mind to become agitated or to become, motivated to seek some new experience. So there's this sort of hamster wheel that we're on. And that's all that we've ever experienced. We've never actually experienced that any of the things that we are labeling as happiness are actually bringing true happiness. They're just briefly giving us a sense of respite, a sense of distraction from an agitation that was there in the previous moment. Um, so that's, I would say, incredibly important, to just, I'm not, you don't have to accept that it's true, but to just ponder, because if it is true that everything that we think is happiness is actually in the nature of suffering, that's a really big difference between how we are seeing things and how the Buddha sees things, how these Arya beings are seeing things. And it has real consequences for what we are spending our time, spending our energy, what we're putting, what we're pursuing, what we're trying to manifest, what we're trying to do with our lives. So, I would say it's arguably, more important than the suffering of pain to really just spend time contemplating. And then this idea of all pervasive suffering, and then I'll pause for questions, but all pervasive suffering is just the idea, and we'll go into this as we go through the course, um, but the idea that there isn't any kind of being that is having an ordinary experience that isn't conditioned by the suffering of pain and the suffering of change. That there is no place that um, we can't escape just by um, you know as you probably know, and as we'll go, as we'll look through the course, the concept of rebirth is a central tenet in Buddhist philosophy. The idea that the mind associates with form, and it does that again and again and again, is a sort of central idea. But from the Buddhist perspective, there are no forms that are free from being conditioned by the suffering of pain or the suffering of change. No ordinary forms. No, so we can't just wake up one day in a different body, in a different kind of, that is free from. And that's all pervasive suffering, is just this idea that as long as our mind is ordinary, as long as we haven't trained our mind, then we will be experiencing some kind of lifetime that's conditioned by the suffering of pain and the suffering of change. Um, so that's true suffering. And so we as ordinary beings, we have our own idea of true suffering, right? This is true suffering from the perspective of an Arya being. But our idea, of true suffering is, well, suffering is, homelessness, suffering is, sickness. Um, it's just the suffering of pain. It doesn't really go to these deeper levels. And so we think that what we can do about that is, get a good education, get a good paying job, be insulated from homelessness, being insulated from poverty, have good health care, take care of the body, hopefully be insulated from extreme sickness. Um, but from the Buddhist perspective, suffering goes to really, really deep levels. And it is primarily what's happening in the mind. It's primarily this mental, because as I said, the thing that motivates pleasure-seeking behavior is agitation occurring in the mind. The idea in the mind at the present moment isn't sufficient, that the present moment is unpleasant, and we need to change the present moment by engaging in some new activity. So for the Buddha, this is a very mental process. And so the things that we have to do to address true suffering are much deeper than just, amassing wealth, amassing a good reputation, doing the kinds of things that we are doing that we think hold us back from suffering. We think that a good job, stable family, good reputation, we think those are the things that hold people back from suffering. And the Buddha says, no, people who accomplish that, they suffer just as much as anyone else suffers. Um, so the antidotes, and but we'll get to um, this getting more and more hopeful as we go through, the Four Noble Truths. Ultimately, we see that there is a reason why things are this way, and that there's a way to put an end to that, and that there is a process of putting an end to that. And so it's actually not this kind of really dark, hopeless, pessimistic message. What it is we do have to understand that that there is a problem. We have to, in a way, they describe the Four Noble Truths, that there's a way of describing it that's sort of related to the idea of a medical model, um, which is you begin with a recognition that there is a problem, right? If you go to the doctor and you're like, well, I'm experiencing this, and your doctor says, no, you're not, or you're making it all up, or it's not true, then you can't get better. So the first noble truth is about recognizing and understanding that things are not ideal, that there is a problem. And if you don't do that, you can't address it. You're stuck until you really, really clearly address it and understand not only is there a problem, but it goes to really, really subtle levels. And so it's going to require really subtle, really deep solutions. Um, and then the second noble truth is, you know, that, you also would want your doctor not only to agree with you that there is something wrong, but you would want your doctor to say, and I know what its origin is. I can tell you you have this particular, I can diagnose you with this. Because if your doctor can't, they have to not just agree, but they have to be able to diagnose it. But even that doesn't go far enough. You want your doctor to also say, and I've seen people recover from this. I know that this isn't terminal. This isn't, I know that people have recovered. But even that isn't enough because you actually need your doctor to give you the course of treatment. They need to be able to say, here's the medication that is the reason that all of these other people have recovered, or here's the surgery that I know how to do that will remove this from your body. Um, and that's kind of a very similar progression that you find in the Four Noble Truths, that yes, there is a problem, but there is a specific reason why there is this problem, and it can be completely eliminated. This problem can be uprooted. And not only that, but the method exists. We understand the method, we can explain the method, people can practice the method, and they can get that result of eliminating that origin of suffering. And that's the whole point. The point isn't just the first noble truth. We do have to confront suffering if we have any hope of uprooting it, but uprooting it is the point. And so Buddhism is actually a very, very optimistic, very hopeful message. It isn't that the Buddha just said, oh, well, yeah, things are terrible and that's it, because like His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, well, if that's all the Buddha said, then sure, like go drink, go, do drugs, go party, because everything is terrible. And that's sort of the best you can do. But the Buddha didn't stop at the first noble truth. He said, yes, there are these problems, but they have a specific cause. That cause is removable, and I can tell you, I can explain to you how to go about removing it. I can show you what to do that reliably, repeatably does remove that suffering. Any questions about the first noble truth?
I have a another question. Arias? I was confused by that. I thought that was more of a yoga. And if since it is Mahayana and all that, are they recognized? Is it like I apologize for my pronouncement, bodhisattvas? They're similar to that? The beings that come back? Or the
So, so yeah, so an Arya being or an Arhat, there's ways of different ways that the word is used. It isn't the goal of Mahayana Buddhist practice. Becoming an Arya being, becoming an Arhat, isn't the goal of uh, Mahayana or Tibetan Buddhist, or there's other Mahayana schools, but it isn't the goal, but it is the goal of the Theravadan tradition. In the Theravada, which you find in the Southeast Asian countries. Generally speaking, Mahayana Buddhism is what you find in the Northern Asian countries, countries like Japan, um, parts of Korea, China, India, Tibet, the Northern Asian countries. The Southern Asian countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, those are the Theravadan Buddhist countries. Generally, that's just kind of generally how the teachings spread from and how they were adopted. Um, there's a Pali canon and a Sanskrit canon, and it's just sort of like historical reasons why in some places some teachings took root and in other places other teachings took root. Um, but so for a Theravadan practitioner, the goal is arhatship, is achieving this individual liberation, but for the Tibetan tradition, the goal is a fully enlightened Buddha. Um, and which goes further. It goes further than an arhat. So, an arhat is someone who directly sees the nature of reality directly. And it does lead to, for that person, it leads to a state where they are beyond suffering, where their mind separates from the body at death and it does not reincarnate, does not take another ordinary form. Um, and this is an explanation of arhatship from the Mahayana perspective. There's a different way that in the Theravadan countries they understand arhatship. Um, but regardless, it is a goal of Buddhist. The Buddha taught the path of arhatship. The Buddha taught that it is a valid path that the Buddha taught for people that were attracted to that way of practice. The Buddha also taught the bodhisattva path or the bodhisattva ideal. And that's the ideal in the Tibetan tradition, the path of the bodhisattva, rather than the path of the arhat. And the path of the bodhisattva culminates in full enlightenment or becoming a Buddha. Whereas an arhat is not a Buddha, is not a fully awakened Buddha. And it's a little bit technical, but essentially, a person can see the nature of reality directly. They can become an arhat and they can achieve individual liberation. But when they do that, there are what are called the subtle obscurations to knowledge or subtle obscurations to omniscience. They remain in the mind stream of a practitioner who validly achieved individual liberation, achieved arhatship, but they operate to prevent that consciousness from achieving full enlightenment, full Buddhahood. And the practical difference between those two states, they're both paths of practice taught by the Buddha, but when a person achieves individual liberation or arhatship, their mind is abiding after death, after the separation of body and mind in that lifetime. Um, that consciousness abides in a state where they do not suffer. They have no suffering of any kind, but that mind is kind of separated from all of the other minds. It's separated from all of the places where consciousness is existing. It's sort of off, isolated from that. A fully enlightened mind is also a mind that has no suffering of any kind. Um, Perfectly blissful experience. But that consciousness, because the subtle obscurations to omniscience have been removed from that mind has the capacity to intentionally reincarnate, to, under the force of compassion for sentient beings, to take rebirth where ordinary sentient beings are, where they exist, for the purpose of helping those ordinary sentient beings, because they have a mind that, as they're doing that, their mind is completely omniscient. Their mind, which means that they can see all that can be, they can know all that can be known. That mind itself has that capacity. Your mind, my mind, all consciousness has that innate capacity to know everything that can be known. Um, but you have to develop that capacity. You have to establish that capacity in the mind. It's not just, it's a latent capacity that has to be trained in. It has to be developed, just like, we have the ability to do mathematics. But if you live in a place where no one teaches you mathematics, then you don't have that ability, right? Your mind can do it. You can learn that 1 + 1 = 2. You can learn how to read, how to write. But if you're not around anyone who has that knowledge, then you won't be able, it's not spontaneous there in the mind, but it's a capacity of the mind. So omniscience is a capacity of the mind if it is trained in, if it is developed, if it is accomplished. And the Buddha just is simply someone who did that, who accomplished that, who trained in that and got that result. And then he spent his whole life saying, this is what I did, and you can do it too if you follow in my footsteps. If you do the same kinds of things that I did, you can get this same result. You yourself can be completely free of sickness, aging, and death, really, all of those sufferings, by training your mind in this way. And then at death, your mind will separate from that physical form, and it will abide either, if you follow the path of an arhat, it'll abide separately, or it'll abide as a Buddha, a fully enlightened being. And from the Mahayana perspective, going for that, Buddhahood is better in a sense, because you're able to then use that state to be of benefit to all of the ordinary beings that are taking rebirth and that are suffering. Whereas an arhat, they can't use they are abiding, they themselves have achieved their own welfare. They've achieved their own highest welfare, but they can't utilize that state which they are remaining in. They're not able to use that in a way that is of benefit to ordinary sentient beings. But a Buddha can utilize that state. So it's presented as like more beneficial, more useful to accomplish that. Um, and like I say, I mean, there are historical reasons why some teachings took root in some countries, and I mean, of course, now there's access to other teachings, but there are these historical reasons why things are kind of embedded in various cultures, and why things are, certain paths seem more attractive to certain types of people than other paths. Just like, it's true that if you're a Catholic, you also know that Protestantism is a thing that exists in the world, but maybe you're not so excited, about, you're like, well, no, I'm a Catholic. I'm good. I'm fine with being, I'm not going to become a Protestant because I'm a Catholic and I'm fine with that. Anyway, it's kind of like that. Like, yes, they're aware that there are other things, but they've got their own thing, and that's what they're doing. But they're both paths taught by the Buddha for practitioners of different dispositions. Okay. So then you've got, so we'll try to briefly just go through the remaining. So true causation or true origin. Um, so this is why suffering exists. This is why ordinary sentient beings experience suffering. It's because the mind of an ordinary sentient being is necessarily a mind that is conditioned by what are called the three root poisons or the three root delusions of anger, attachment, and ignorance. Here, fundamental ignorance, or ma rigpa, is the Tibetan fundamental ignorance in English. So, and these are difficult. We'll make more sense of this as we go along, but essentially, we, under the influence of, we are necessarily someone who hasn't seen the nature of reality directly. That is an ignorance that is present in the mind, and under the influence of ignorance, when we observe things, when we are cognizing anything, we are cognizing almost everything that exists as either pleasant or unpleasant. Things that we enjoy, things that we don't enjoy. There are some things that we're kind of neutral about, like if there's a pencil on the table, we're probably not having an emotional reaction to the pencil on the table. But, you know, we're like, oh, this is helpful, or this is not helpful. I enjoy this, I don't enjoy this. And we tend to believe that there is something intrinsic about the object that is pleasant or that is unpleasant. And we tend to think that, well, I like pleasant things and I don't like unpleasant things. So I'm going to go through my life collecting all of the pleasant things and pushing away all of the unpleasant things. That's going to be my approach to my life, is bringing into my experience, because these things are in the nature of happiness. They're in the nature of being pleasant. And these other things are in the nature of being unpleasant, or they're in the nature of suffering. So I have no choice really but to try to bring into my experience pleasant things and push out of my experience unpleasant things. And so that gives rise, that those sort of fundamental primordial drives give rise to anger and attachment. Anger is kind of the wish to harm that which is unpleasant, to, when, to kind of violently separate oneself from anything that seems like it's threatening one's pleasure. We get frustrated, we get angry, we get, when we can't be unseparated, when we're forced to experience the unpleasant, we get angry. We want to be separated from that. We get frustrated, we get angry, and even sometimes, we become actually violent, we become aggressive. When we can't be separated from what we think is intrinsically unpleasant. And then when there are things that are, we think, intrinsically pleasant, we feel like our happiness depends upon remaining in contact with them. And that's attachment. That's a mind that mistakenly believes that in order for me to be happy, I must always be in contact with what I perceive to be pleasant, from the side of the object, pleasant objects, things that are outside of oneself, that are in the nature of happiness, that are in the nature of pleasure, that in order for me to be happy, for me not to suffer, for me to experience bliss and enjoyment, I must be in contact with. That's attachment from the Buddhist perspective. And it's all based on fundamental ignorance, which is just the result of not having trained the mind to see the nature of reality accurately, directly, in a correct way. Um, and then all of the other states of mind that that are suffering are some combination of these three root delusions, jealousy and envy and maliciousness and, all of these other painful states that we experience. They are some combination of anger, attachment, and ignorance. And that is because the mind has these mental states operating within it, necessarily we will suffer. Uh, However, things we start to turn the corner again with true cessation. So true cessation, and we just really talked about true cessation. You have individual enlightenment or nirvana, and then you have full enlightenment or enlightenment. So there's different ways of talking about it, but individual enlightenment is one way, nirvana, lower nirvana, and higher nirvana. There's different ways of talking about it, but these are the two paths of practice that the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught a valid path of arhatship, a valid path of individual liberation or lower nirvana. He also taught the path of full enlightenment that culminates in Buddhahood. And these are both true cessations. And these are the only true cessations. If we don't achieve at least one of these, we will suffer. We will, because fundamental ignorance will be present in the mind, because anger and attachment will be present in the mind, we will naturally give rise to painful experiences again and again and again. But they can be ceased, all of those painful states can be ceased either by accomplishing individual enlightenment or full enlightenment. And then these are the three higher trainings, which are the true paths. So we give rise to individual enlightenment or universal or higher enlightenment by following the paths of the three higher trainings, the training in ethics, the training in meditative concentration, and the training in wisdom. Wisdom ultimately being the wisdom that can see the nature of reality directly. Okay. So that's going to be it for today. Any questions?
Never mind. Just answered my own question.
Okay. No other questions? All right. So we will pick it back up. So yeah, like I said, everything that we're going to look at really is going to just explain more about, what is suffering, what is its origin, how is it ceased, and how do you go about ceasing it? That's everything that the Buddha taught. The Buddha basically said, I only taught two things, suffering and the ending of suffering. And so again, we have to understand, we can't run away from suffering. We have to understand it in exquisite detail, and that's uncomfortable. That's certainly true. That part of it, understanding it. But again, it's like if you're a heart surgeon, right? You have to understand everything that can go wrong about the heart. You have to understand all of the ways in which disease can affect the heart, all of the defects, everything. You have to understand that in exquisite detail, but it's not to be morbid. It's not to just dwell on that. The purpose is so that you can do something about that. The purpose is because you want people to be well. The purpose is you want to eliminate diseases of the heart. And that's what the Buddha did. The Buddha has to teach us how to understand the depths of suffering so that we can have really, really effective antidotes. And that's the point. So we have to keep in mind that it's not this depressive, pessimistic philosophy. Because what the Buddha is saying is that our potential, the potential of the mind that we have in this moment, is the same mind that the Arhat has, is the same mind that a fully enlightened being has. It's just a mind that's undergone all of the training that the Buddha is going to give us. But it isn't like a different mind. It's like this is, before and after a person gets a PhD, they have the same mind, but they weren't a doctor and then they were a doctor. You weren't a Buddha and then you were a Buddha, but you had the same mind the whole time. You just cultivated it, you just trained it, you just developed it. But it's not some sort of like special mind that only Buddhas possess and we don't possess. We have everything in our mind that Siddhartha had when he took birth and then he trained his mind. It's just, he had anger, he had jealousy, he had all of these afflicted states, and he got rid of them. He trained the mind and cultivated it and eventually achieved that result. And then all he did was spend his whole life telling other people how to do what he did. So it's not a revealed teaching, it's not a mystical teaching, it's all really very scientific. And the Buddha just said, this is what I did, this is what I discovered, and here's, if you would like to do it, this is the method, this is what I did, and this is what you should do. So that's what we're going to look at, is all of these methods for doing what the Buddha did. Because he was also an ordinary sentient being that had a mind that's just as messy as the mind that we have, but it isn't, it's fixable. There's a method that can lead us to this result. And again, because it is the Tibetan tradition, the result that we're encouraged to adopt is the result of full enlightenment. That is the particular result that's part of this tradition. But okay, any last thoughts or questions before we end?
No, but thank you very much for your time. You
Sure.
definitely gave me some more insight I wasn't aware of. So thank you for doing that.
All right, well, have a great weekend and hope to see everybody again next week.